Good morning and welcome to the dining room at Morabinda. Behind me you will see a very large collection of memorabilia from the First World War, collected by my grandfather, who was a doctor on the front line. I have taken his pieces because this is a great interest in my life, and they came with me to Australia from Ireland. He was in the British Army, and in all he was in 25 campaigns, but the First War was one of the ones that had the most profound impact on him. When I came to Australia first, I was absolutely delighted to find that Anzac Day was a realistic event, that the boys who had gone and sacrificed their lives were recognised. I grew up in Ireland in the 60s, during the Troubles, and there was no mention of the First War. The young men who went to fight from Ireland went for many different reasons, but most of them went for economic reasons. While they were away, there was a rising, and the Irish sentiment towards the British really changed. So when the boys returned from the First War to Ireland, they were regarded as people who had fought for the enemy. So it was a great revelation for me to come to Australia and see that I could openly celebrate the lives of those people who had gone and suffered, and for those who had come back and sacrificed their youth, sacrificed their mental health, and were never really the same again. When I first came, I was very fortunate to meet a wonderful man called Pam Kensit, and I met him at a place called the Narrower Memorial Hall. Well, this hall had been built by the returned servicemen to honour their friends and comrades who hadn't come back, and Sid Kensit had been a driving force behind that. Sid Kensit is a great uncle of David's, and he and his brother Percy both went to the First War. Luckily for me, the family had kept numerous letters, and I started to be lent these letters very generously by the family and put together a group of letters to begin with. And that was the beginning of Dust to Mud. However, 12 years of research, etc., and delving into other people's lives, I have managed to put together a book that tells of the experiences of country people in New South Wales during the First War, and of the difficulties of the women and the older men who were left behind because of the dearth of young men who had gone to the war. So, shearing teams were depleted. Farm workers were impossible to find. Women found themselves doing jobs that they would never have imagined they had to do. Generally, the countryside, per se, the rural sector, was depleted of young men. Rural men were the first to enlist, and they were the ones who were in the light horse. They were the ones who were very patriotic. And over the period of the war, particularly at the beginning, it was found that recruiting in the rural sector was very strong. I would have to point out at this point that during the two conscription referendums, it was rural people who voted no to conscription because they were fearful of the loss of more young men. Australia is the only country that has ever had a referendum on conscription, and there was one in 1916 and one in late 1917. Both of these referendums failed. Both were a unanimous no vote. And at this point I would add that the boys on the front line voted no to their mates being forced into coming into the army, because they felt that nobody should be forced to go into those ghastly trenches unless they had a patriotic feeling, a patriotic wish to be there. To force someone there would have just been cruel. That said, the boys who were in training in England at the time voted yes, because they hadn't had that awful experience of the ghastly trenches. So moving on from conscription, I'll go back to my initial primary sources of this book. Mrs. Kensit had kept a very, very good diary or group of diaries over the period 1899 to 1926. And so I was able to use her diaries during the war to trace what was happening in rural Australia. And I have used this district as an example of anywhere. It was the same mothers who were living in Canandra that lost their sons. They were the same people throughout the whole of the rural sector. And it wouldn't make a difference if it was in northern New South Wales or southern New South Wales. The farms were still depleted. People were working double the time. There was a general consensus that their boys had been taken from them and they were short of workers, short of just general labour. Dust to Mud follows the lives of a couple of people. One in particular is a young man called Frank Willis. Frank Willis lived in Crookwell. His mother was very eager for him to sign up. His father was not. And Frank Willis, luckily for me, bought a camera as he was out one day in Cairo, and his photographs feature the whole way through this book. This photograph that you're looking at has a horse with no rider in the middle. Well, Frank had got off to take the photo. This little area here is his hat. Sadly, Frank was killed, and I'll get on to that in a few minutes. His photographs came back, but his camera didn't. Thursday, 6th August 1914. The Sydney Morning Herald editorial announced, "War declared. For good or ill, we are engaged with the mother country in fighting for liberty and peace. This is not a war of aggression upon which the Britons have entered, but one in defence of small nations threatened with humiliation, and if not with extinction, and above and beyond, everything our armies will fight for is British honour. What remains for us this end of the world is to proceed our souls in patience while making the necessary contributions of time, means and men to carry on the great war upon which so much depends. It is our baptism of fire." Mrs. Kensit, however, records in her diary, "A telegram came at home at midday. War declared between England and Germany." This announcement marks a notable change in the tone of Mrs. Kensit's diary. From this point on, she talks about Mr. Kensit's fear and worry. 10th of August, Mr. Kensit went in the buggy up to the post office to see what the war news was. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson of Hollywood came to hear of any war news. There was fear within the Kensit household because Mr. Kensit had had experience. However, warfare took on in Australia in the most hefty way, with promises from all sides of government. There was an election coming up, and there was promises left, right and centre. There was a mad rush of young spirited men to enlist for fear they might miss out if the war was over by Christmas. April 1915. After church at Narrowa, New South Wales, near Crookwell, between Crookwell and Burra, on the 25th of April, the Kensit family and their friends gathered at Woodford. While they drank tea and ate ice cakes, Australian troops of the first wave to go ashore at Anzac waited in open boats for the slaughter. There was a brief announcement in late April alerting the public that the Australians were in action. However, the Sydney Morning Herald reassured their readers that the Australians, though not in France, had contributed with great value to the war. The interesting thing about this was that the British war correspondent, Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, was allowed to go ashore, and the Australian war correspondent, Charles Bean, was not. So the report that we were receiving in Australia, or the reports, it was generally one report and then it was distributed to all papers, was a rather false, glowing account of the affair. And then the casualty list came in. The reality shocked the nation. At first, the newspapers attempted to print all the names of those who had died or been wounded at Gallipoli. The lists were too long. Local papers named their men, and soon lists of the dead were displayed in places like railway stations. The grim task of notifying the families of the dead fell upon the clergy. The clergy were given this hideous job about informing their next of kin. It struck fear into the community when a clergy was seen approaching a house. This fear lasted many years. When the boys were at Gallipoli, their position was really quite appalling. And I have here some of the implements that they may have used. This is a battered bugle and a water bottle. It was described, the smell was described like a field of 1,000 dead sheep. There was flies. What we've got to understand is it was all taking place in a very small space. There were dead piling up in one corner, there were wounded in another corner, and this was all taking place on a tiny piece of beach with a tiny piece of headland. We have no concept as to the crowded conditions, the disease, the smell, the absolute heat during the summer, and then the absolute cold as the winter drew in. The greatest success of the entire Gallipoli campaign was the evacuation that took place in very late December, in which basically only one person was killed. Here we have a postcard of 2 Australian soldiers, and if you look carefully, you will see in the middle, under that bush, within that bush, is a Turkish spy. And this was a postcard that could be bought and sent home to mum or dad.